As she got ready for bed, her mother's words echoed in her mind. Change happens slowly, then all at once. But now she'd add something to that wisdom. Change happens when ordinary people decide to do extraordinary things, when one person's courage becomes another person's hope. Tomorrow, she'd be back in the operating room, saving lives with steady hands and years of training. But her other work would continue too, the work of making sure every voice was heard, every complaint taken seriously, every person treated with dignity. Because sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments of resistance, with one person standing up and saying, "No more." And sometimes those changes last forever. 3 months after the hearing, Olivia stood in front of a room full of new police recruits. The training manual in her hands was still warm from the printer, its pages outlining the department's completely overhauled complaint procedures. "Your badge gives you power," she told them, looking at each eager face. "But real power comes from how you use that authority to help others." In the back of the room, Officer Chen smiled, remembering that rainy day when everything started to change. She was wearing detective stripes now, earned through her work on the investigation that had exposed years of systematic bias. The police station felt different these days. The old complaint box was gone, replaced by a computerized system that automatically tracked and monitored every report. Photos lined the walls. Female officers, minority officers, community leaders, all part of the new oversight committee. Captain Barrett's office had a new occupant, a veteran officer known for her dedication to community policing. The shelves that once held Barrett's golf trophies now displayed community service awards and thank you letters from citizens who'd been helped by the department. At the hospital, similar changes were taking root. Dr. Thomas had been removed from his position, his medical license under review. The harassment prevention program Olivia helped design was becoming a model for other hospitals across the state. You know what the best part is? A young resident told her after a particularly challenging surgery, "Now when something happens, we know we can speak up. We know someone will listen." That evening, Olivia sat in her mother's kitchen, just like they used to do years ago. The mayor was making her famous sweet potato pie, her way of celebrating small victories. "The new training program starts next week," Olivia said, helping to peel potatoes. "And 3 more hospitals have adopted our reporting system." Her mother nodded, adding cinnamon to the mix. Change happens slowly, then all at once, like waiting for water to boil. Speaking of change, Olivia smiled. Officer Chen, Detective Chen now, told me something interesting. Remember that domestic violence case Barrett dismissed last year? They reopened it. The victim finally got her restraining order. The kitchen timer dinged, its sound mixing with distant traffic and neighborhood sounds floating through the open window. Normal sounds, everyday sounds, but in a city that felt somehow different now. "You never did use my name," her mother said suddenly, putting the pie in the oven. "That day at the station, you could have ended it all with one sentence." Olivia thought about that moment, about Barrett's dismissive wave, about all the women who didn't have a mayor's name to drop. "It wasn't about who I was," she replied. "It was about who we all are." Later that night, she got a text from Detective Chen. Another woman had come forward, not with a complaint, but with a success story. The new system had worked exactly as designed. Her stalker had been arrested, her case taken seriously from the very first report. As Olivia drove home, she passed the police station. The lights were on in the complaint division, where a new team worked late hours ensuring no report went uninvestigated, no voice went unheard. The old complaint box sat in a corner of the museum down the street now, a reminder of how things used to be. At a stoplight, she noticed a young woman walking into the station, looking nervous but determined. Officer Rodriguez, one of the new recruits she'd trained, held the door open with a welcoming smile. The scene was simple, ordinary even, but it represented everything they'd fought for. Her phone buzzed, a message from the hospital board. They wanted her to speak at next month's medical conference about implementing systemic change. "Your story," the message read, "is helping other institutions recognize their blind spots." Pulling into her driveway, Olivia thought about all the other Dr. Richardsons out there, all the other Officer Chens, all the women still fighting battles in other cities, other institutions. Change was spreading, not like a tidal wave, but like roots growing deep and strong beneath the surface. Inside her house, she found an envelope from the police academy. They wanted her to make the training program permanent, to share her story with every new class of officers. Not just the part about being dismissed, but the part about standing up, speaking out, and creating change. This isn't just about punishment, she said. This is about change, real change. Every woman who walks into that police station deserves to be heard. Every person who reports harassment deserves to be taken seriously. Not because of who they know or who their parents are, but because it's right. The hearing continued for hours, but the outcome was clear. Barrett's career was effectively over. Dr. Thomas would face the hospital's ethics board. But more importantly, systems were being rewritten, procedures reformed, voices finally heard. As people filed out of the room, Officer Chen caught up with Olivia. You know, when you first walked into the station that day, Barrett thought he was showing his power by dismissing you. Olivia smiled, gathering her files. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is prove someone wrong about who we are, and, in doing so, help others prove the same thing. Outside, the afternoon sun broke through the clouds. Change was coming to Central City, not in loud declarations or dramatic gestures, but in the quiet determination of people who had finally said enough. And somewhere in her office, Mayor Richardson smiled, knowing her daughter had fought this battle not with privilege, but with persistence, just as she had taught her. The hearing room felt smaller than usual that morning. Every seat was filled, with people standing along the walls. Dr. Olivia Richardson sat at the front table, her evidence folder open before her, hands steady despite the tension in the air. Captain Barrett sat across the aisle, his usual confidence replaced by nervous finger-tapping. His eyes kept darting to the door, perhaps hoping this would all somehow go away. Behind him, Dr. Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his seat, looking nothing like the intimidating figure from the hospital corridors. The review board members filed in, 3 police commissioners, 2 city council members, and the hospital board president. Mayor Richardson had recused herself, but everyone could feel her influence in the room's charged atmosphere. Dr. Richardson, the lead commissioner began, please share your account of the events. Olivia stood, her voice clear and steady. 3 months ago, I began documenting inappropriate behavior from Dr. Thomas, my senior colleague at Central City Hospital. When his actions escalated to stalking, I attempted to file a police report. She opened her folder, pulling out printed screenshots, security camera stills, and witness statements. I have here 37 documented incidents of harassment, 12 witnesses willing to testify, and security footage from both the hospital and police station. Captain Barrett's lawyer leaned forward to whisper something, but Barrett waved him off, his face reddening as Olivia continued. When I approached Captain Barrett with this evidence, he didn't just dismiss me. He demonstrated the exact kind of systemic bias that allowed Dr. Thomas's behavior to continue unchecked for years. The security footage played on the room's screens. Barrett's dismissive tone echoed through the speakers. Women like you always think your problems deserve special attention. That's taken out of context, Barrett interrupted, standing up. I had no idea who she was. Exactly, Olivia replied calmly. You had no idea I was the mayor's daughter. No idea I was a neurosurgeon. You saw only what you wanted to see. Another woman you could safely ignore. Officer Chen stepped forward next, carrying her own stack of evidence. We've documented 43 similar cases in the past 5 years. All women, predominantly minorities, all dismissed without proper investigation. Dr. Thomas's lawyer tried to object, claiming this was beyond the scope of the hearing, but the commissioner shut him down. This is exactly the scope, she said firmly. This hearing is about pattern and practice, about systems that protect the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. More witnesses came forward. A nurse described how Dr. Thomas had followed her to her car. A young resident detailed late-night meetings she couldn't refuse. Each story built upon the last, creating a picture of institutional failure that could no longer be ignored. Then came the turning point. Lieutenant Wong presented the enhanced security footage from multiple incidents, showing not just Barrett's dismissive behavior, but also his systematic burial of legitimate complaints. He didn't just ignore these women, Wong explained. He actively discouraged them from pursuing justice. He marked serious complaints as resolved without investigation. He buried domestic violence reports that could have prevented escalating abuse. Barrett's face had gone from red to ash gray. I was following established procedures. No, Officer Chen cut in, her voice sharp. You were creating procedures that protected people like Dr. Thomas while punishing people who dared to speak up. Dr. Thomas stood suddenly, his chair scraping loudly. This is a witch hunt. These women are clearly coordinating their stories. Like you coordinated with Captain Barrett? Olivia asked quietly. She pulled out one final piece of evidence, text messages between the two men discussing how to handle complaints against prominent community members. The room erupted in murmurs. Barrett's lawyer dropped his pen. Dr. Thomas fell back into his chair, the fight draining from his face. This ends today, the commissioner announced, her voice cutting through the chaos. Captain Barrett, you're suspended pending further investigation. Dr. Thomas, the hospital board will convene immediately to address your status. But Olivia wasn't finished. She stood one last time, looking not at Barrett or Thomas, but at the women lining the walls of the room. Tomorrow, he announced, we present our findings to the review board. This isn't just about Captain Barrett or Dr. Thomas anymore. This is about changing the system that protected them. As the team dispersed for the night, Officer Chen lingered, looking at the photo of Dr. Richardson from that rainy day in the lobby. You know what's ironic? She said quietly. Barrett thought he was showing his power by dismissing her. Instead, he gave her exactly what she needed, proof that the system was broken. Wong nodded, turning off his desk lamp. Sometimes the biggest changes start with one person being underestimated by the wrong person at the right time. Outside, the city lights blinked on one by one, like truth emerging from darkness. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight, justice had a head start. The evidence was gathered, the stories were documented, and the silence was finally broken. Lieutenant Wong's office had become command central for the investigation. The walls were covered with timeline charts, the desk buried under statement forms and interview transcripts. He rubbed his tired eyes, looking at the security footage from the police station lobby for the 10th time. Play it again, Officer Chen said, leaning forward. Look at his body language when Dr. Richardson mentions the documentation. On screen, Captain Barrett's dismissive wave and turned back told the story that no written report could capture. The timestamp matched perfectly with Dr. Richardson's detailed notes. 5 years, Wong muttered, shuffling through another stack of complaints. 5 years of similar reports, all buried or dismissed. Look at this pattern: single women, minority women, anyone he thought wouldn't fight back. The door opened and Officer Lopez stepped in, carrying another box of archived complaints. Found these in the basement storage. They were marked resolved, but never actually processed. Ken started sorting through them, her expression growing darker. 3 domestic violence cases, all marked as insufficient evidence without any follow-up. 2 harassment complaints against prominent businessmen, marked as unfounded without investigation. The phone on Wong's desk rang, the hospital board requesting all documentation related to Dr. Thomas's case. As Chen gathered the files, a young officer rushed in. Lieutenant, you need to see this, he said, holding up his phone. Security footage from the hospital parking garage. Dr. Thomas following Dr. Richardson to her car last month. The video was grainy but clear enough. Dr. Thomas's aggressive stance, Dr. Richardson's obvious discomfort, the way she had to circle around to her car's other side to avoid him. Send that to the board immediately, Wong ordered, and get me the garage logs for the past 3 months. Let's see how many times this happened. Across town, the hospital's HR department was conducting its own investigation. The director sat across from a nervous resident, gentle but persistent in her questioning. You're not the only one, she assured the young doctor. We've had 5 others come forward just today. You're safe here. The resident twisted her hands in her lap. He said nobody would believe me, that it would ruin my career if I reported him. And when I heard how the police treated Dr. Richardson, things are different now, the HR director said firmly. We're listening, we're acting. And we're not alone. Back at the station, Wong's team had created a digital timeline of both cases. Red flags popped up everywhere, missed warnings, ignored protocols, clear patterns of bias. Check this out, Officer Lopez called out. Remember that coffee shop owner who reported harassment last year? Barrett told her she was misinterpreting friendly customer service. Turns out the guy was arrested last week in another county for stalking. Chen added another pin to their evidence board. How many others were there? How many people gave up because he wouldn't listen? The answer came in waves. Women began calling the station, asking to reopen old cases. Hospital staff members stepped forward with their own stories about Dr. Thomas. Each new revelation connected to others, forming a web of systemic failure. Late that afternoon, Wong received an email that made him sit up straight. "Chen," he called out, "remember that security footage of Barrett's interaction with Dr. Richardson?" The tech team enhanced the audio. "Listen to this." The room fell silent as Barrett's voice played clearly through the speakers. "Women like you always think your problems deserve special attention. Maybe if you spent more time doing your job and less time complaining." Chen's hands clenched into fists. He knew exactly what he was doing. This wasn't negligence, it was deliberate. The evidence was overwhelming. 5 years of documented bias. Dozens of mishandled cases. Clear patterns of discrimination that couldn't be explained away as simple oversight. Wong gathered his team for a final review. The whiteboard behind him was covered with connecting lines between cases, dates, and names. It told a story of power abused and trust betrayed, but also of courage. The courage of every person who had come forward, every officer who had spoken up. Her phone buzzed. A text from Olivia. "Just finished in surgery. How did it go?" Angela looked out at her city, thinking of all the daughters out there, all the mothers fighting different versions of the same fight. "Change is coming," she typed back. "Slowly, but it's coming." She had just set down her phone when her assistant appeared again. "Ma'am, Internal Affairs wants to meet. They found something in the archived complaints. Something big." Angela nodded, straightening her jacket. The day wasn't over yet. The fight was never over. But for the first time in a long time, it felt like they were finally winning. Mayor Angela Richardson stood at her office window, watching the city wake up in the pale morning light. The report on her desk felt heavier than its actual weight, page after page detailing complaints ignored, voices silenced, trust broken. Her daughter's name jumped out from the middle of page 3, a punch to the gut she hadn't expected. Her assistant knocked softly. "The police oversight meeting starts in 20 minutes, ma'am." Angela nodded, gathering her composure along with her files. The mother in her wanted to storm into that precinct and demand answers. The mayor in her knew she had to handle this differently. The meeting room was already full when she arrived. Captain Barrett sat near the front, uniform pressed, shoes shined, the picture of authority. He didn't notice how the female officers avoided his gaze, how the room shifted uncomfortably when he spoke. "How community relations are excellent," he was saying, pointing to a chart. "Response times are down, complaint numbers are low." "Because you never filed them," someone muttered from the back. The room fell silent. Angela cleared her throat. "Captain Barrett, could you explain your procedure for handling harassment complaints?" He straightened, clearly pleased to have the mayor's attention. "Of course, ma'am. We take every legitimate complaint seriously." "Define legitimate," Angela interrupted, her voice calm but firm. Barrett blinked. "Well, obviously we have to prioritize. Real crimes take precedence over misunderstandings." The word hung in the air like smoke. Angela opened the folder in front of her, her heart pounding as she saw Olivia's neat handwriting on the statement form. "Let's discuss a case from last week," she said. "A female doctor reporting workplace harassment. According to this, you suggested she was overreacting." Barrett's smile didn't waver. "With all due respect, Mayor Richardson, people often exaggerate their situations. This particular woman has 3 medical degrees and a history of documented harassment by a senior colleague," Angela finished. "Did you even look at her evidence?" The room was so quiet you could hear the old heating system clicking. Barrett's confidence cracked, just slightly. "I handle dozens of complaints every day," he said defensively. "If she wanted immediate attention, she should have mentioned that she was my daughter." Angela's voice could have frozen fire. "Is that what it takes to get equal treatment in your precinct, Captain? A connection to power?" The shock that rippled through the room was almost visible. Barrett's face went from red to white in seconds. "Mayor Richardson, I had no idea." "Exactly. Angela stood, addressing the whole room now. You had no idea she was my daughter, just like you had no idea the nurse you dismissed last month had security footage of her stalker. Just like you had no idea the teacher you turned away had documented death threats from an ex-husband. She spread photos across the table, women of different ages, backgrounds, all holding complaint forms, all turned away. This isn't about my daughter, Captain. It's about every woman who walked into this station asking for help and walked out feeling worthless. It's about officers in your own precinct too afraid to speak up about what they've witnessed. Officer Chen, standing by the door, straightened her shoulders. Other officers began to nod, the dam of silence finally breaking. But Mayor Richardson, Barrett sputtered, surely you understand the pressures we're under. Resources are limited. Interesting, Angela cut in. Because according to these records, you found resources to immediately investigate when the golf club president reported teenagers loitering in his parking lot. When the bank manager complained about homeless people near his ATM. When your friend's daughter said her bike was stolen. She let the implications sink in. Barrett's face had gone from white to gray. There will be a full investigation, Angela continued, her voice level. Not because of who my daughter is, but because of who all these other women are. Mothers, daughters, sisters, citizens who deserved your protection and got your prejudice instead. The meeting continued, but Barrett barely spoke another word. As officers began sharing their own observations, their own documented patterns, he seemed to shrink in his chair. Afterward, Angela found a quiet moment in her office, her hands shaking as she finally let herself feel the full force of her anger, not just as a mayor, not just as a mother, but as someone who'd fought this same battle decades ago. He left without responding, but Olivia noticed her hands weren't shaking anymore. Sometimes courage was contagious, spreading person to person like a whispered truth. Sometimes change started not with a shout, but with careful documentation, quiet conversations, and people finally deciding they'd had enough. As she gathered her things to leave, her phone lit up with a message from Officer Chen, emergency meeting tomorrow. Internal Affairs wants to hear everything. All of it. Olivia smiled, thinking of Captain Barrett's dismissive laugh, of Dr. Thomas's threats, of all the voices that had been silenced before. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, those voices would finally be heard. Officer Chen's report landed on Internal Affairs Lieutenant David Wang's desk on a Tuesday morning, tucked between routine paperwork and coffee rings. By Wednesday afternoon, 3 more officers had come forward with similar stories about Captain Barrett's pattern of selective enforcement. It's like watching dominoes fall, Officer Chen whispered to her partner during their lunch break in the precinct parking lot. She picked at her sandwich, stomach tight with anxiety. 4 years of incidents. 4 years of watching people walk away feeling helpless. Inside the station, the atmosphere had shifted. Officers exchanged glances in the hallways, conversations dropped to whispers when Captain Barrett passed by. He noticed nothing too secure in his position to sense the ground shifting beneath his feet. Meanwhile, across town at Central City Hospital, Dr. Olivia Richardson faced her own battles. She stepped out of the operating room after a 6-hour surgery, only to find 3 more messages from Dr. Thomas, the colleague she tried to report. Just wanted to check on that dinner invitation, the first message read. You can't avoid me forever. The others grew progressively less professional. Olivia saved the messages to her growing file of evidence, her hands steady despite her racing heart. As she walked to her office, a nurse caught her eye and hurried over. Dr. Richardson, the nurse spoke quietly, glancing around the empty hallway. I heard about what happened at the police station. My sister had a similar experience with Captain Barrett last year. She tried to report her ex-husband's threats, but she trailed off, twisting her ID badge nervously. Olivia touched her arm gently. Would your sister be willing to talk about it? Every voice matters now. Back at the police station, Lieutenant Wang sat in his office, surrounded by statements and complaint forms that had somehow never made it into the official system. Officer Chen's detailed notes provided dates, times, and a pattern that couldn't be ignored. Look at this, he said to his colleague, spreading out the documents. 3 domestic violence complaints never processed. 5 harassment cases marked as low priority. All from minority women, all dismissed by Barrett. The evidence mounted hour by hour. A young resident at the hospital approached Olivia after rounds, sharing her own story about Dr. Thomas's inappropriate behavior. 2 more nurses came forward. The pattern at the hospital mirrored the one at the police station, people in power protecting people in power, while others suffered in silence. That evening, Officer Chen found an envelope on her desk. Inside was a transfer request to parking enforcement, effective immediately. Her hands shook as she read it, but then she noticed something else: signatures from other officers, dozens of them, on a petition supporting her original report. "They can't silence all of us," her surgeon said, dropping another stack of statements on her desk. "Not anymore." Dr. Richardson's phone buzzed during a consultation. Another message from Dr. Thomas. "Saw you talking to the new resident. Hope you're not spreading rumors. That could be bad for everyone's career." She showed the message to the hospital's HR director, who had finally agreed to meet with her. The director's face darkened as she scrolled through the chain of escalating texts. "This is beyond inappropriate," she admitted. "And you tried to report this to the police?" To Captain Barrett specifically, Olivia replied. "He suggested I was overreacting." The HR director set down her phone, looking troubled. "The board needs to know about this, both situations, the harassment here and the police response. This is exactly the kind of systemic failure we can't ignore." As the sun set over Central City, the ripples continued to spread. Lieutenant Wong's office lights burned late into the night as he pieced together years of overlooked complaints. The hospital board scheduled an emergency meeting. Officer Chen's fellow officers began speaking up about other instances of bias they'd witnessed. And Dr. Thomas, unaware of the gathering storm, stopped by Olivia's office one last time. "You're making a mistake," he said from the doorway, his usual smile now brittle with tension. "Some people might say you're being hysterical about a few friendly messages." Olivia looked up from her computer, where she'd just finished documenting the encounter. "Interesting choice of words," she said calmly. "Captain Barrett said something similar. You know what they said about history repeating itself." The garage's exit gate lifted slowly as she pulled forward, the late afternoon sun breaking through the clouds. She had a surgery to prepare for, a dinner with her mother to plan, and a story to tell, one that would reshape more than just her own experience. Sometimes justice worked in unexpected ways, and sometimes being underestimated was the greatest advantage of all. The elevator doors in the police station opened with a tired ding as Dr. Olivia Richardson stepped inside. Her finger hovered over the parking level button when a voice called out, "Hold the door, please." Officer Michelle Chen rushed in, arms full of case files. She glanced at Olivia, then did a double take, her eyes widening with recognition. "Dr. Richardson, I didn't expect to see you here. Is everything okay?" Olivia managed a small smile, remembering the young officer from last month's city fundraiser. They'd chatted about Chen's mother, who'd recently undergone surgery at Central City Hospital. "Just trying to file a complaint," she said quietly. Though apparently that's harder than performing brain surgery these days. The elevator hummed as it descended, and Officer Chen shifted uncomfortably. "Did something happen?" "I mean, if you don't mind me asking." Olivia considered her words carefully. "Let's just say Captain Barrett made it very clear that my concerns weren't worth his valuable time." The elevator stopped, and as they stepped out into the parking garage, Officer Chen's face clouded with understanding. "Captain Barrett, he didn't realize who you were, did he?" "No," Olivia replied, fishing her car keys from her purse. "And I didn't tell him. Being the mayor's daughter shouldn't be a prerequisite for being treated with basic respect." Officer Chen clutched her files tighter, looking troubled. "You know, you're not the first person I've seen walk out of here feeling unheard. But you might be the first one who could actually do something about it." The fluorescent lights of the parking garage cast harsh shadows as Olivia leaned against her car. "My mother taught me something important when I was young," she said, memories of late-night conversations in their kitchen floating back. She said that power isn't about making people know who you are, it's about using who you are to help people who have no power at all. A police cruiser's engine echoed through the concrete structure as Officer Chen glanced nervously over her shoulder. "There's been talk, you know, about how certain complaints just disappear. Especially from people who look like," she trailed off, but Olivia understood. "Like me." Olivia finished softly. The weight of unspoken words hung between them. "I've been keeping notes," Officer Chen admitted, shifting the files to one arm and pulling out her phone. Times, dates, names. I just never knew what to do with them. It's not exactly the kind of thing a rookie officer brings up if she wants to keep her job. Olivia thought about her own carefully documented incidents at the hospital, the growing file of unwanted encounters and disturbing messages. Sometimes the right moment finds you, even if you weren't looking for it. As if on cue, her phone buzzed, a text from her mother. Dinner tonight? Haven't seen my favorite neurosurgeon in weeks. Olivia smiled at the message, imagining her mother in her office across town, probably surrounded by stacks of policy papers and city budget reports. You're going to report him, aren't you? Officer Chen asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Captain Barrett, I mean. Olivia tucked her phone away, her decision crystallizing. No, Officer Chen, we are. Your notes, my experience today, patterns matter. Change happens when people stand together. A door slammed somewhere in the garage, making them both jump. Officer Chen quickly composed herself, straightening her uniform. I should get back. But Dr. Richardson, she paused, choosing her words carefully. That fundraiser last month. Your mom said something about how real leadership means lifting others up when you rise. I think I understand that better now. As Officer Chen walked away, her footsteps echoing through the garage, Olivia sat in her car, thinking about ripples, how one stone dropped in still water could create waves that reached every shore. She pulled out her phone again, this time opening her email. Mom, she typed, about dinner tonight. There's something we need to discuss. But first, I need to tell you about my interesting visit to the police station today. She hit send, knowing that what started as a frustrating encounter with one dismissive police captain was about to become something much bigger. Not because she was the mayor's daughter, but because sometimes the right person in the right place at the right time could shine a light that helped others find their voice too. Starting her car, Olivia thought about all the other women who'd walked out of that police station feeling powerless and unheard. Captain Barrett's dismissive laugh echoed in her memory, but now it felt less like an insult and more like the beginning of a change he never saw coming. For now, though, Olivia had a surgery scheduled in 3 hours. She'd handle that the same way she handled everything, with precision, professionalism, and persistence. The rest would unfold in its own time. The autumn rain drummed steadily against the windows of Central City Police Station as Dr. Olivia Richardson pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders. She'd rehearsed what she needed to say a dozen times on the drive over, each word carefully chosen. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as she approached the front desk, her hospital ID badge still clipped to her belt after a long shift in the neurosurgery department. I need to file a complaint, she said, maintaining the same steady tone she used when delivering difficult news to patients' families. The desk officer barely glanced up, sliding a form across the counter with practiced indifference. Fill this out and drop it in that box, he muttered, pointing to a stuffed metal container in the corner. Olivia took a deep breath. Actually, I'd like to speak with someone directly. The situation involves ongoing harassment at Central City Hospital, and I have documentation of multiple incidents. The desk officer's radio crackled, and he held up a finger, turning away to respond to some routine call. Olivia stood there, gripping her leather portfolio containing weeks of carefully documented incidents, text messages, and emails. She'd watched her colleagues' behavior escalate from uncomfortable comments to showing up uninvited at her office after hours. Finally, Police Captain James Barrett emerged from his office, coffee cup in hand. The desk officer gestured toward Olivia with a shrug. Says she wants to file a complaint in person. Cap. Captain Barrett gave Olivia a cursory look, the kind that made it clear he'd already decided this wasn't worth his time. She recognized that look. She'd seen it too many times before, but it still made her stomach tighten. Ma'am, we have procedures for filing complaints, he said, not bothering to invite her to sit down. If you fill out the form, someone will review it and get back to you. With all due respect, Captain, Olivia began, her voice steady despite the frustration building in her chest. I'm a neurosurgeon at Central City Hospital. A colleague has been exhibiting increasingly threatening behavior, and I have evidence of. Listen, Barrett cut her off, setting his coffee down with a sharp tap. Everyone thinks their situation is special. Everyone thinks they need immediate attention. File the form like everyone else. If it's as serious as you say, someone will contact you. Olivia pulled out her phone, opening her calendar. I can show you the pattern of incidents. Just last Thursday. Ma'am, Barrett's voice took on that patronizing tone she knew all too well. You might be overreacting to a workplace disagreement. Have you tried talking to HR? Because right now, I've got 3 active cases on my desk involving real crimes. The implication hung in the air like smoke that her fears, her experiences weren't real enough to matter. Olivia had spent years building her career, earning respect in the operating room, only to be dismissed here as if she were a child making up stories. She straightened her spine, channeling the same determination that had gotten her through medical school. Captain Barrett, I'd like your badge number and the precinct's complaint procedures. He actually laughed at that, a short, dismissive sound that echoed in the quiet lobby. Badge number's right here, he tapped his chest, and the complaint box is right there. Now, if you'll excuse me, some of us have serious work to attend to. As Barrett turned away, Olivia caught her reflection in the rain-streaked window, her mother's determined chin, her father's steady gaze. She could almost hear her mother's voice. Sometimes, sweetheart, letting them show who they are is more powerful than telling them who you are. She carefully tucked her documentation back into her portfolio, noting Barrett's badge number and the time. The same meticulous attention to detail that made her an excellent surgeon would serve another purpose now. As she walked toward the exit, her footsteps echoing on the linoleum, she pulled out her phone and made a brief note. The rain had let up by the time she reached her car, but the knot in her stomach hadn't. She sat there for a moment, hands on the steering wheel, thinking about her mother's office across town with its view of the city she served. But she wouldn't call her, not yet. This wasn't about being the mayor's daughter. This was about being heard, about being taken seriously as a professional, as a person. She started her car, watching through the windshield as Captain Barrett strolled past, heading to his personal vehicle. He didn't glance her way. She was already forgotten, just another overreacting woman he dismissed today. But soon enough, he'd remember this rainy afternoon, this interaction he considered so insignificant. Soon enough, he'd learn that sometimes the biggest mistakes come from the smallest moments of disrespect.